Hi everyone! So we're doing things a bit differently this year. No, this week. Geez, it already feels like it's been a year. That's what happens during pandemics, right? And no, this is not a skunk on my head, it's just kind of a funky hat. It's very hot though, so I'm going to try to make this quick. So this week, week 3, we're doing things a little bit differently. The PowerPoint is going to be split in two, and instead of being assigned an entire chapter to read, you're going to be assigned bits of two different chapters. So these slides and these videos, I'm making one to go with each chapter. Okay, so don't worry, it's not more work than usual. It's roughly equivalent in terms of reading and in terms of total video length. Okay. So this first part here, and by the way, the reason I'm doing that is that this is an intro course, so it's a tip of the iceberg sampling of a whole bunch of different topics. And the chapters that we're looking at this week, they're very interesting, but they go into a lot more depth than what is needed for this course. If you are really passionate about things around biological evolution and our primate relatives and you want to know more, you're absolutely, obviously welcome to read the entire chapters if you want to, now or later on. We also have usually in the winter semester, so it's being offered now, and so after the intro course, you'll be able to take it the following winter. There's a course on human evolution where you're going to get to go into more depth on the genetics behind it and kind of the history of evolutionary thought. So for this course, though, we're just going to really look at what we need to know to be able to look at human evolution in particular. All right, so here on this first slide here, you have the pages that correspond to the material that I'll be talking about in this video and in these slides. So you can look at those sections. When you have a thing like this where you have pages 51 to 54, that means like on page 51, you'll see a subheading. You start at that subheading. And then on that last page, on page 54, you stop when there's a new subheading that's going beyond that page range, okay? So there we go. And I'll be referring to some of these pages as we go along. And down here, once I'm done here, I'll be linking to this video. You'll know that if you're looking at this, it's because you'll have clicked there, all right? So let's get right into it. So just this first kind of chunk of the semester, we're focusing on biological anthropology, and to remind you of what that is, it's that subfield or branch within anthropology that takes a very specific interest in the biological side of things. And that doesn't mean that there's no interest in culture, because, we talked about the biocultural approach, and that's going to be coming back to haunt us in a couple of weeks when after we've looked in more depth at our biological evolution, we'll be able to see where culture fits in there. All right. So, for example, changes in biological features over time. So when you hear about, ancient humans like Neanderthals and things like that, that falls into that domain, sometimes referred to as paleoanthropology. Our relationship to other living organisms. So we're part of the animal kingdom, and when we talk about evolution, a lot of it is about tracing back to those relationships, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So primatology, for example, is a subfield within biological anthropology that takes a specific interest in the biology and cultural features of our closest relatives among the primates. So the primate order is one group of mammals that includes all kinds of monkeys, apes such as gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, and us. Human biological diversity today. So we're going to talk about that this semester too. You might have already learned somewhere else that the concept of race does not apply to humans. We're not a race, we're a species, and we also can't be split up into different races. We'll talk more about that in a few weeks, but biological anthropology takes an interest in how, there are obviously biological differences between humans, and a lot of it has to do with very old adaptations to different parts of the world. Okay, so that's something else that we'll talk about in a few weeks. So life on Earth, the planet's been around for about 4.5 billion years. And this picture, I put it there, and when I'm in class, I kind of navigate over to the original image so we can look at it in a larger size. But when you're looking at these slides on your computer, you might be able to zoom in a little bit, but you also can click on this link, which I'll kind of go over and look at it here. So if there's a link, this is the picture that I'm using in the PowerPoint, but if you follow the link at the top of that slide, it'll take you to this Google search where you can see a whole bunch of timelines of human evolution, and some of them are meant for kids, some of them are bogus, you gotta watch what you find on the internet, but some of these are credible sources, and depending on how your brain works, you can look at different ones. Like this one looks kind of cool, and it shows so the planet's been around for billions of years, and you can kind of see over that period of time what's been going on. And you see here Homo sapiens, that's our species. So relative to how long the planet has been in existence, we haven't been around for that long. So there's been life forms over all that time. And sometimes when people think of evolution, they think of one cell turning into maybe a fish, and then fish turning into a lizard, and that lizard turning into a bird, and that bird turning into a dinosaur. It's more complex than that, all right? But evolution definitely does have to do with the relationships between all these living things. So back to our slides. So this is something you can look at. All right. So what's evolutionary theory? I mean, you might have heard about some controversies that happen in some parts of the world, in particular in the United States, in some states where there are disagreements about whether evolution should even be taught in school, and often these are regions where Christianity is very strong, and some fundamentalist Christians who kind of are a bit anti-science. And I always like to tell my students, you know what, if in your religion you have a different belief, that's fine. I'm not here to tell you what to believe, but I do expect you to try to understand what evolutionary theory is. If you wind up disagreeing it for religious reasons, that's your choice. I think that religion and science can be compatible because our spiritual beliefs help us understand why we're here. It's kind of like a heart thing, a spirit thing, but scientific knowledge and intellectual knowledge helps us understand the mechanisms of it. So I don't see them as opposing things. But I've had some students refuse to answer questions on evolution. And you know what? For this course, you still need to understand it. You can understand something without agreeing with it. So evolutionary theory, well, what is it? So it's based on the idea of evolution, which is simply change over time. Okay, and that's important. It's a very simple definition for a complex phenomenon. Okay, but so evolutionary theory, and you can see this in different words, but this is based on page 45 of the textbook. Is the idea is that. And by the way, theory doesn't mean that it's not true, right? So people tend to mix up in popular language hypothesis and theory. A hypothesis is something you think is true and you're trying to test it. But when it becomes a theory, it's been validated and proven with scientific study. So theory doesn't mean that it's false and that they're just guessing, okay? And if you've taken any science courses, you probably already know this. So the idea is that living organisms change over time, over long periods of time, sometimes shorter depending on the circumstances, and this can lead to the existence of new species. And we'll talk about what a species is very shortly, but when we said before that, there are all these different living organisms that have existed in the past few billion years, and they're related, that's because sometimes there are certain situations in which one species can give rise to another. And, sorry, just realized I hadn't turned my phone ringer off, and I didn't want us to get interrupted. So I like to be transparent about such things. And so the idea is that all living things are related. And if you click here, this will take you to a video that I really like. It's about 3 minutes long, not even, 2.5 minutes long. And this guy, through visuals and clear explanations, gives you a very good idea of what we mean when we talk about common ancestry. So if you're looking at this, I encourage you to pause this video, look at the slides, find that page, and click on that link. And by the way, in PowerPoint, you have to be in viewer in presentation mode to be able to click on a link. And I encourage you to do that. If you don't do it now, when you're having a look at the slides on your own, it's explained in the textbook, this idea of common ancestry, but this guy explains it very well. And so it's worth having a look at it. So just in a nutshell, just to kind of, and legally I can't really show you the video in my video because I think that might be some kind of weird plagiarism thing, but so that's why I'm encouraging you to look at it. This is annoying. So the idea is it's similar to, families, right? So when you think, if you have any siblings who were born from the same parents, and again here we're talking about the biological relationships. We're not thinking in terms of whether you like these people or whether anybody was adopted. We're just looking strictly at the biological reproductive level. So if you have biological siblings who are born from the same parents, well, those parents are your closest common ancestor. And then if you look at your cousins, so the biological children of your parents' siblings, well, your most recent common ancestors, your grandparents, right? Because your parents, say your mother's sister, well, their ancestor was their parent, which is your grandparent, and right? So the further you go out in these relationships, the further back the common ancestors are. And that's the same thing with living things. And if you have a look at page 48 in our textbook, it kind of shows you that at the, within the animal kingdom. So that's kind of a neat thing to look at too. And you've probably, again, seen this in biology classes as far back as maybe, the second or third grade. If you did your education here, it's a very common thing where they'll say, well, we're a part of the animal kingdom, and you might have had to learn the different, classes, such as, mammals and things like that. So you might already know that we're mammals, and all mammals are vertebrates, and they kind of split these bigger groups, and you get more and more specific. Now in high school biology they tend to not go all the way, but then if you look at mammals, all these animals that are mammals, within that you have different orders. Okay, so that's another box. We'll talk about that in the next set of slides a little bit more. And so we're part of the primate order. So, at some point there was that first primate, and then all the other primates descended from that common ancestor. So that's what we're talking about here. So something important about evolution is that it's a neutral concept. And what I mean by that is that sometimes in everyday speech, people mistakenly talk about evolution as though it's about getting better, so that humans today are necessarily better than humans that existed before us, or that humans as a species are better than other species, more advanced. And it's not like that. That's not how evolution works. It's all relative to a specific environment. Okay? So we're not better than humans that existed, say, 2 million years ago. They were adapted to their environment. And honestly, most of us, if you sent us back in time 2 million years ago, we wouldn't know how to survive. Most of us can't, if we forget our cell phone at home, we're like, oh my God, how am I going to live through this day, right? So without easy electricity, many of us haven't necessarily learned how to start a fire on our own to be able to cook our food. How would we even, if you haven't grown up in a family that hunts, how would you even get food? So, it's all about what environment. And that said, humans living in different parts of the world have adapted to different environments, and that's something that'll come back when we talk about biological variation today. So it's not about being better, it's about being well adapted to a specific environment. And that brings up the idea of adaptation. And adaptation, it's a very broad concept. Okay, it's really how an individual or group becomes better suited to an environment. And this, we've all had to adapt to the pandemic life, right? Anytime there's a transition in your life, you as a person adapt. You adapted from CEGEP to high school to CEGEP. If you've had to move, you and your family have moved to a new apartment or a new town, you adapt, right? You get used to something. But when we're talking about adaptation, in the evolutionary process, we're talking about something that generally takes place over a very long time. And we'll learn eventually too that within a lifetime, sometimes biologically we can adapt to certain things, like living high up in the mountains with the different oxygen levels. But that's not what we're talking about here. Okay? Here we're talking about very long-term evolution through adaptation at the species level. Okay? And that takes place over many generations. And it also, that kind of adaptation that leads to evolution happens at the level of a species. Now, I've used that word a few times. The guy in the Common Ancestry video uses it. So if you haven't looked at it yet, it's important to clarify what that means. They talk about it a little bit in the textbook, but it's kind of buried. So I want to highlight what we mean, right? So it's at the level of species that biological adaptations that lead to evolution happen. And what's a species? Classically, it's defined as a group of living organisms that can reproduce fertile offspring. So humans are a species, dogs are a species, roses are a species, birds aren't a species. There are many, many species of birds. There are many, many species of trees. There are breeds of dog, but dogs are a species. You can crossbreed dogs. Now, this, if you take if you've taken biology, or if you wind up taking biology or hardcore genetics, that definition isn't completely, like, it's got its limitations, especially because now we know that sometimes species can reproduce and create fertile offspring. Classically, what they used to say was that, for example, you would sometimes have reproduction between two species, but their offspring would not be fertile. They would be hybrids. So a classic example is a mule. A mule is a hybrid. It is the product of a donkey and a horse mating with each other. They're two different species, donkeys and horses. They're related, but they're not the same species. And to make more mules, you have to keep mating donkeys with horses. Mules can't make other mules, so they're not fertile. So the idea was that, a species was defined in that way, is that you can reproduce internally and create more fertile offspring that will continue to reproduce that species. But now they're starting to see things like coy wolves, which are, a species that results from mixing wolves and coyotes, and they are fertile. So science is always changing, right? But what's important for our purposes to retain, it's not so much about whether they can crossbreed, it's more about understanding that a species is a very closely related group of living organisms. Okay? So let's talk about natural selection. It's another term that is very commonly misunderstood and misused. You've probably all heard jokes about natural selection in action. If somebody does something that seems kind of ridiculous and they die as a result, right? And people say, oh yeah, natural selection in action. They thought the window was closed and they leaned on it and they fell out the window and got killed, or, people having big parties during a pandemic and, dying as a result. I mean, it's harsh, but that's not natural selection, okay? Because natural selection doesn't act on the individual as such. So you can read more about this on these pages here. Starting on page 51, there's a subheading called Natural Selection. And if you read right through to page 54, and you can stop just before How Did Biologists Learn About Genes, it kind of covers the basics of natural selection. What is it, you might ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. I'll give you my explanation, then we'll talk about how the textbook explains it, and hopefully one of these definitions will make sense to you, because we all have different brains, right? And it's not that natural selection is complicated. It's a little bit complex, but once you understand that it's really a mechanical process, it actually winds up making a lot of sense. It's actually pretty intuitive. So it's a process, all right? Natural selection is a process, and organisms, again, at the species level, typically, you'll have organisms that are better suited or better adapted to a specific environment. Remember, it's always about a specific environment. Well, those who are better suited to surviving in that environment are more likely to reproduce successfully, meaning that they'll survive long enough to be able to reproduce. and therefore transmit their genes. Okay, so that said, we are really talking about something that happens over the course of several generations. That person that does something without thinking and isn't necessarily using the best judgment and dies as a result, they might be 63 and maybe they've already had kids. So there you go. That's not natural selection. It's really about it's a multi-generational process, and it impacts an entire, that shouldn't be it impacts an entire, see, spell checker doesn't catch these kind of things for your essays. It impacts an entire species or group within a species. Okay, and so it's really again, it's not an individual thing. And what can happen, and this helps us connect it back to that common ancestry thing, and this is also mentioned, buried in the book somewhere, this concept of speciation can happen as a result. So that's where one species gives rise to one or more other species. Okay, so for example, you might know that species like dogs and wolves and coyotes and foxes, they're all related. So at some point, if you go far back enough in time, you had an original species that was ancestral to these different species. And what happens is that maybe they're occupying an area and they're adapted to that environment. Maybe there's an environmental change. Maybe some of them migrate somewhere else, and that smaller group adapts in a way that's specific to that new environment. And over time, they can change so much that they become a whole other species that's still related to the parent species, but is a different species. So the textbook uses these words here, and if you look at page 52, you'll see a box at the bottom with a definition, and it says that it refers to it as a two-step mechanistic explanation for how descent with modification takes place. So descent with modification is terms that Charles Darwin used when he came up with this theory of natural selection, where genes, well, he didn't know about genes, okay? That was discovered later. But he knew that there was something about our biology where we passed on physical traits to our offspring, but that there were minor changes at each generation. Okay, so step one is that in every generation there are differences within the population, so differences within a species. They say variant individuals are generation within a... Wait, what? Every generation, variant individuals are generated within a species. Okay, I have to rewrite this. So I'll read it from the textbook. Every generation, variant individuals are generated within a species because of genetic mutation. Okay? We're not going to go into mutations, but they're not what you think they are. They happen in our genes. We all have a bunch of little mutations. We get our genes from our parents, and they're little changes. Often they don't even affect us, okay? Sometimes they can harm us, so some diseases that we know of that are lethal. And sometimes they help us, all right? So those variant individuals who are best suited to the current environment survive and produce more offspring than other variants do. So that means that within a population, within a species, you'll have some people who carry genes that help them survive in that specific environment. And those wind up being advantageous features. And we'll look at some concrete examples soon and it'll make more sense. But if you have a genetic makeup that makes it more likely that you will survive in that environment, you're also more likely to reproduce, to live long enough to reproduce and pass those advantageous genes on to the next generation, and so on and so forth. So it's really looking at how over many generations some adaptive traits wind up being dominant within a population. And again, this changes depending on the environment. What's adaptive in one environment might be harmful in another. So Darwin figured this out by looking at these birds called finches. And, if you've learned about Charles Darwin already, and there's some information in the textbook, but it goes into more depth than what we need. But if you're interested, go ahead and have a look. But you can see here's one chart, but you can also see another chart on page 45 that where they look at these finches. And he was on the Galapagos Islands, and you can see here at the bottom, so here's South America, all right, and here's a green area here, the mainland, and here in the box is where the Galapagos Islands are, and you can see them here. So what he figured out through observation and taking notes and observing all these differences between these different species of finches, which is a category within, you know, birds, he speculated that there was a parent species, so a common ancestor to all these species on the mainland, and, you know, so this one here, and at some point in time that common ancestor migrated, you know, they split up. Some of them probably stayed on the mainland, but some of them went to these different islands. And these different islands all had their own niche environments. So if you look at these different species of finches, they have different kinds of beaks, right? They have different shades of color. So depending on what is available in a particular environment in terms of food, those different beaks might have different advantages. So for example, you know, tree finches, they're insectivores, right? So all these species here, they eat bugs. So maybe the kind of beaks that they have, depending on the island there are, or where do those bugs live, and what is the best beak that will help you get them? Are these bugs living in little holes in trees? Are they, you know, where are they and how do you get them? And what is the best kind of beak? So if you're on one of these islands and you don't have the kind of beak that will easily allow you to get those bugs, well then you're probably not going to live long enough to pass on the genes for that kind of beak. You know, same thing here. So granivores, you know, they eat grains, maybe nuts, and, you know, they tend to find their food more on the ground, right? So again, the beaks are different, and also the camouflage with the feather color. All right, so he was able to kind of go, they're all related, they all have a common ancestor, right? And here, as you go through, you also have other divergences. So, you know, here's one branch and they became a species, but then here you go, oh look here, there was one species here that split into these two lines, another here. Every time you see two lines, that's a split. That's an incidence of speciation, where you had one species that wound up splitting into other species. Okay, so you have, you know, a couple of concepts here: common ancestor, all right, common ancestry, and then you know, speciation. And that speciation happens largely because of natural selection. You had, you know, again, you had this parent species. There, you know, they had maybe different kinds of beaks within that species, and maybe that worked on the mainland. But then when they got to these islands, well, on some of these islands, some of the finches were at an advantage because of the kind of beak they had. So the principles at work in this process, according to Darwin, and also Wallace, who discovered this at the same time but through different means, Darwin's more well known because he published first, is that first of all you have variation. So there are different physical traits within a population or a species, right? So different shapes of beak, for example. Heredity. So even though he didn't know about genes, or both of them, neither one of them knew about genes, they figured out that these traits are passed down from one generation to another, from parents to offspring. And so then natural selection happens, where the individuals with the most adaptive traits within an environment, remember, are more likely to live long enough to reproduce and pass on their traits. So that, folks, is what natural selection is. Here's a concrete example that is it's a classic example in anthropology classes. If somebody learns, you took an anthro class and they ask you about the peppered moths and you say, we didn't talk about that, they'll be like, what? You didn't really take an anthropology course? You're lying to me. I'm only exaggerating a little bit, but it's a classic example because moths don't live as long as people. Their lifespans are very short compared to humans. So scientists were able to actually observe natural selection as it was happening in this species. So peppered moths, there's variation within the species with respect to color. So you have some light ones here, they're kind of speckled, and you have some dark ones. Now, this was observed during, before and during the Industrial Revolution in England, I believe, or somewhere in the UK. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, in the population, there were more of these light-colored moths. Why, you ask? Because they were well camouflaged against the lichen on trees. So that's where they spent a lot of their times, on trees that were covered in lichen, which is a light colored mossy kind of thing. And the dark ones, well, they stand out more on that background. So the birds would catch them more easily, or other predators who would eat moths. Not me. Whatever floats your boat. I haven't tried it though. I'm not knocking it. So, if you stand out for predators, you're less likely to live long enough to reproduce. It doesn't mean you never do. So in the population, there were always a few dark ones, but there were more light-colored ones, okay? And if you know about genes, you'll know that it's complicated because you can carry a gene without it actually showing. So the genes for the darker color would still be present in some of these light-colored individuals. And you can learn more about that if you read the textbook. We're not going to go into that genetic stuff. So here, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, on this left picture, so you see, if I was a bird and I need an entree, wow, what am I going to pick out first? I'm going to see this one. There's one here, but I won't see it so much because it's camouflaged against the lichen. Now, what happened during the Industrial Revolution? You might have learned this in a history class at Vanier or in high school. There was, factories producing a lot of pollution, and the lichen was getting, dirty. All that pollution was making the lichen in the trees darker. So now who stands out more? It's the lighter colored ones. Okay, so this affected natural selection because before the Industrial Revolution, in the population you'd have more of these light-colored ones, but then after that, these ones began to dominate, and we can see that here, right? Generation 1 during, so at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, you have more light-colored ones. Well, then the trees start to get darker, so they're less camouflaged, and they start to die off more, right? So Generation 2, here all of a sudden you're seeing these are the ones that get to reproduce more. So in the following generation, there are more of the dark-colored ones. Generation 3, the dark-colored ones far outnumber the light-colored ones. There's been measures against pollution since then, so it's reversed a little bit, but this is a really good example, and it's a classic example that shows natural selection in action. Okay, so you have variation, that first principle that we looked at, different colors among the moths, and that's a good thing. You need to have variation in a species exactly for this reason, because if there are environmental changes, some of the members of the species will survive and pass on their genes through heredity. So again, even though they knew, at the time they didn't know what genes were, they knew that this was something that could be transmitted to offspring. Now we say that it's genetic because we know about genes. They didn't know that at the time. So natural selection is able to happen because depending on the environmental circumstances, one color of moth is more likely to survive long enough to reproduce. All right, so as we saw before the Industrial Revolution, it was one thing, and after it was something else. So that's, in a nutshell, what natural selection leading to evolution is. Just if you're interested in knowing more and going a bit beyond, it's interesting to see that among humans there are traits that don't necessarily serve an adaptive function anymore, but they did among some of our common ancestors. And you'll see vestigial traits. There's some things, and you can click here, and there's a short video. You'll need to scroll down a bit on that page, but it's about 4 minutes, and it's actually really interesting. You'll learn that some of us still have a tendon here that we don't really need, but not everybody has it, right? And other things that are like, oh, okay, this used to be adaptive among an ancestral species, but not today. And here are some other resources for those of you who like to geek out on these things. You can check these out. This crash course biology video crash course is great on YouTube. They have all kinds of subjects. So this one is about natural selection, and they go into a bit more depth about the genetics behind it if you're interested. So if you have any questions, let me know.